builder developer, the consideration received is less than the stamp duty value, then an addition can be made based on the stamp duty value. So these are a specific instruction where a specific provision is made to tax the notional income. But in the absence of any such specific provision, in case of rental income, if rent is my business income, then in case of business income, you cannot compare it with the letting value or the ratiable value. Or in case of a property which is not let out, you cannot tax the hypothetical rental income based on considering that property to be deemed a let out. If the property is not held as a stock in trade, if the income from such property is taxable under the income from house property, then of course the question of determination of annual value will come. And then in course of determination of annual value, 23(1) says you have to consider the letting value, 23(2) says you consider the actual rent. So finally you have to take higher of the hypothetical renting value and the actual rent. Now the subsection 5 which has been inserted, which says that for a period of 1 year, or after the amendment now 2 years, annual value will be taken as nil. This question will arise only in a situation where, first of all, in principle, we accept that in case of a builder developer, the unsold properties would fall under the income from house property. Because if in principle, we come to a conclusion that those unsold properties in case of a builder developer, which are stock in trade for him, will only fall under income from business, then there is no question of determination of annual value for 1 year or 2 years. That dispute is pending before the Supreme Court to classify the head of income. Now, pending that dispute before Supreme Court, Gujarat High Court earlier in very old decision of 2007, in Neha Builders case had taken a view that in case of builders, the correct head of income is business income, and therefore in case of stock in trade, hypothetical letting value cannot be taxed. Delhi High Court in Ansal did not agree with this view. In Mumbai, this decision of Pune Tribunal and Balaji Ventures also subsequently, I think, in this Rajendra Goshalwar, Mumbai Tribunal, they have consistently taking a view that where there are two different decisions, one of Gujarat High Court which is in favor of assessee, another of Delhi High Court which is against the assessee, what should be followed is a view favorable to the assessee, and therefore in case of a builder developer, in case of unsold properties, deemed letting out concept cannot be applied. There was one decision of Bombay High Court in 377 ITR Sane and Doshi Enterprises. There is some noise in the background. If everybody can mute their mics, it will be better. In case of Sane and Doshi Enterprises, department tries to rely on this particular decision because in this particular decision, High Court had ruled that where stock in trade is actually let out and rental income is received, that will fall under the head income from house property. There also it was a case of a builder, but that decision is distinguished repeatedly by Mumbai Tribunal that in case of Sane and Doshi, there was actual rent received, and therefore the only dispute was whether that actual rent should be taxed under the house property or business income. Whereas in this series of decisions which we are right now considering, there is a scenario where the properties are lying as vacant and no rent is actually received. And therefore distinguishing Bombay High Court, Sane and Doshi Enterprises, Tribunal has been consistently taking a view that in case of builders, unsold stock cannot be considered under the head income from house property and no national addition can. Then in case of Sharan Hospitality, here also there was one interesting proposition that occupancy certificate of the property was not yet received. So the question arose was, can the notional letting value under section 23(1)(a) be calculated for a period for which the occupation certificate was not yet received from the municipal corporation? So in this decision, Bombay High Court held that Section 23(1)(a) talks about a sum for which the property might reasonably be expected to let from year to year. So there is reasonable expectancy to earn rent can be only from a period from which the property is ready to being occupied, and that will be the stage only when the occupancy certificate is received. Therefore, in a situation where say occupancy certificate is received on say 31st of December, the determination of annual value can start only after that period of occupancy certificate, that is from January onwards. For the first 9 months period, even though the property might practically be in the possession of the assessee, department cannot consider it to be a letting value for that particular period, because you cannot have a reasonable expectancy to earn rental income till the occupancy certificate is received. Coming to the next side of income, business income. This Maruti Suzuki decision, it relates to the allowability of MODVAT credit on raw material under section 43. Now, after the introduction of GST, this MODVAT, of course, is not now relevant for us. But if you see the proposition which is laid down in this is very much applicable even in the GST arena, and therefore I selected this particular decision. Now, in this case, what had happened was, when the raw materials were purchased by this company, the manufacturers of those raw material, which had raised an excise invoice on Maruti Suzuki, they had charged that central excise on those raw materials. And as per the MODVAT credit rules, the moment those goods were received and the invoice was received, Maruti was entitled to take an input credit of those goods. However, the liability on Maruti to pay excise duty will come into picture only when the finished goods are manufactured and they leave the factory premises. As we all are aware, excise duty levy is on manufacture. The point of taxation is the removal of goods from the factory. And therefore, till the time there is a levy on the finished goods manufactured by Maruti Suzuki, the goods which are lying in stock, at the end of the year, when there is no levy, there is no question of utilization of that input credit. So the moment raw materials are purchased, they avail the input credit, but as far as the utilization is concerned, utilization will be only against your output liability. Now what Maruti claimed is that the moment I have purchased raw materials, I have paid excise duty, which is included in the invoice, and the moment I have paid this excise duty, I am entitled to a deduction for this under section 43B. And more importantly, they relies on the first proviso to section 43B, which says that if you have not paid by 31st of March, but you have paid by the due date of filing return of income, you will be entitled to a deduction under section 43B. Now this proposition was rejected by the assessing officer, by the Commissioner Appeal, by the tribunal, by the High Court, and finally it reached Supreme Court. Supreme Court held that when you are paying excise duty as a component of your invoice, this payment of excise duty, it does not mean that excise duty on raw material input was actually paid by the appellant. So at the time of purchase, what you are paying is the purchase price of those goods, which might include an element of excise duty, but that you have not paid in the capacity of an assessee under the excise law, but that you have paid in the capacity of a purchaser. See, because suppose I, in my personal capacity, go and buy any excisable goods from a manufacturer, directly from a manufacturer, naturally that manufacturer will raise an invoice on me, and on that invoice he will charge excise duty. But the excess duty which I am paying as a purchaser of goods, as a part of the purchase price, that I am paying just in the capacity of the purchaser and not as an assessee. So Supreme Court held that deduction under section 43 becomes when you have incurred any statutory liability. So in case of Maruti, this incurring of statutory liability, this stage will come only when the finished goods manufactured by it are removed from the factory. And therefore, whatever closing stock is lying in the factory, till the time those goods are removed, there is no liability. And till that time, you cannot say that the excise duty which you have paid on the raw material, but that unutilized credit, you cannot claim as a deduction under section 43B. The assessee when pays the cost of raw material, where the duty is embedded, he is the one who is liable to excise duty on such raw material. It is merely the incident of excise duty that has shifted from the manufacturer to the purchaser and not the liability to the same. Therefore, the unutilized credit under Modified scheme does not qualify for deduction under section 43B. So similar will be the situation in case of a GST. When we purchase the goods, the input credit which is there on the purchased goods, till the time there is a liability, output liability by sale of the goods, if there is no sale of goods till 31st of March or whatever closing stock is lying on 31st of March, on thus that closing stock, there is no incurrence of liability. So even if those goods are subsequently sold after 31st of March, but before the due date of filing return under section 139(1), output liability will arise after 31st of March, and therefore unutilized input credit on such goods, which is unutilized till 31st March, will be eligible for deduction also in the subsequent year and not in this year by relying on first proviso to section 43. Now the next decision of DJ Malpani, Supreme Court larger bench decision, it says that when you are selling a product and along with that selling price of the product, if there is an extra amount received on account of dharmada, so for example, the product is sold for say 100 rupees and along with that there is a 5 rupees extra collected by the seller which is earmarked for the purpose of a charity. So he totally collects 105 rupees. The question was whether this extra 5 rupees received will be considered as price of the product, or in another sense, will it be considered as an income, or in terms of say current law of GST, whether it will be part of a sale price on which GST will be. So earlier also we have decisions of Supreme Court in Bijli, Cotton Mills, etc., which says that this 5 rupees, which extra amount is received, is a voluntary contribution towards charity. It is not towards the purchase of the goods. The purchase of the goods is the occasion, but it is not the consideration for the dharmada. And therefore this 5 rupees cannot be considered as a part of the sale price. This 5 rupees cannot be considered as income of the assessee. This is earmarked for charity, and therefore there is a diversion of income by overriding title. This cannot be considered as business income of the assessee. Another decision, Reliance Industries Limited. This decision, a very popular decision of Bombay High Court in the context of section 36(1)(3), which is more commonly used after the introduction of section 14A, that when in my balance sheet, I have sources of funds, which are of two categories, one interest-free funds, another interest-bearing funds. So if there is no nexus, one-to-one nexus of which funds are used for the purpose of business and which funds are used for non-business purpose or for say making investment from which say dividend income is received, which is exempt from tax, Bombay High Court has held that in a situation where the nexus is not clear, the presumption should be made that the non-interest bearing funds are utilized for the purpose of making investment and therefore indirectly it means that interest bearing funds are used for the purpose of business. So no disallowance should be made under section 36(1)(3). This was the original proposition laid down by Bombay High Court in Reliance Industries case, which is now subsequently contested by department in Supreme Court, and Supreme Court has accepted the principle laid down by Bombay High Court that the presumption should be drawn in favor of the assessee. Now, this logic of 36(1)(3) was later on extended by the assessee in the context of 14A. There also department tried to distinguish Reliance case, that Reliance was only for the purpose of disallowance under 36(1)(3), whereas 14A, there is a statutory formula given under Rule 8D, and therefore Reliance will not apply to this. But in case of HDFC Bank, Bombay High Court again reiterated that whether it is a disallowance under section 36(1)(3) or a disallowance under 14A, the ratio remains the same, that if there are both categories of funds, presumption should be made in favor of the assessee that interest bearing funds are utilized for the purpose of business. To the extent they are sufficient, the provision should be drawn in favor of the assessee. Next decision in case of section 41(1). And this is also one very common addition made under 41(1) by assessing officers. Now 41(1) talks about a situation where any benefit is obtained by the assessee for any expenditure or loss for which he had previously availed a deduction. So say in year 1 I claim a deduction for any expenditure or a loss, and after 3-4 years there is some recovery out of that loss, recoupment of that loss. Then in the natural common sense that firstly I have claimed a deduction, later on there is a recovery, therefore it should be considered as a business income. But now what happens is, in the course of scrutiny, when the assessing officer goes through our balance sheet and there are creditors outstanding in the balance sheet which are outstanding for more than 3 years, a position is taken by the department that because they are outstanding for more than 3 years, there is a statutory cessation of liability by virtue of the Limitation Act, and once the liability has ceased to exist, that amount, even though you have not credited it back to the profit and loss account and it is still lying in your profit balance sheet, still it will be taxed under section 41(1), because these are the creditors for purchases for which you have already claimed a deduction. So one leg of that section 41(1), that condition is fulfilled, that those creditors arise out of my purchases or expenses for which I have claimed a deduction. But for a taxability to come under section 41(1), another important leg is that I should get some benefit out of that liability by way of cessation of that liability. By applying the Limitation Act period of 3 years, whatever creditors which are outstanding for more than 3 years, their entire amount is generally attempted to be added by the department under section 41(1). Now there are a series of decisions. The most popular decision of Bombay High Court was in case of S. Kumar, and also later on various decisions which held that, sorry, not S. Kumar, that decision was in the context of Bombay Dyeing, that merely because creditors are outstanding for more than 3 years, that does not mean that there is a cessation of liability. What the Limitation Act says is that the creditor may not be able to initiate a legal proceeding against me, but that does not mean that the liability is ceased in the eyes of law. Also, there is another interesting angle. If you read section 18 and section 19 of the Limitation Act, it says that till the time I acknowledge the liability in writing, a fresh period of limitation starts. Very interesting proposition. At, say for example, I purchased the goods in the year 2014. So they say the time barring period under Limitation Act generally will run from the year's date of purchase at 2014. However, if there is an acknowledgement of that liability in writing, so in the year say 2015, there is some correspondence with the creditor and I acknowledge that liability in writing. Then from the date of that acknowledgement, a fresh period of limitation starts. So if I acknowledge the liability in the year 2020, even though the goods were purchased in the year 2014, a fresh period of 3 years limitation will start from 2020. And then interestingly, it was held by Madras High Court that where I sign my balance sheet, in which those creditors are included, the signing of that balance sheet by the debtor amounts to an acknowledgement of that liability. And therefore, a fresh period of limitation starts from each signed balance sheet. And therefore, considering this proposition, actually the creditors which are outstanding in my books for more than 3 years are even not barred by the law of limitation if there is a signed balance sheet in which those creditors are included. So this position again was reiterated by Bombay High Court in this Pukhraj Jain's case. Just because 3 years period has expired, that doesn't mean liability has been ceased to exist and it cannot be taxed under 40%. Next decision again Bombay High Court, Perfect Circle India Private Limited, 40A1A. When this initially inserted in the year 2005, that in case there is a TDS default, the whole expenditure will be disallowed. Very draconian, or you can say an insertion of amendment of this kind having a very far-reaching impact since the year 2005. As far as payments to non-resident is concerned, we have clause 1 in section 40A, which has been from the inception of the act. But 1A for domestic payment inserted in the year 2005. Initially, it was restricted only to 4 kinds of payment. Gradually, it got extended to all the payments. Initially, there was 100% disallowance. Now there is an amendment that only 30% of that expenditure will be disallowed in case of a TDS default. Now there was an interesting amendment made simultaneously with section 201, which provides that if the payee files the return of income, he pays the tax on his income and he gives a certificate from the accountant, then the payer who has defaulted in TDS will not be considered an assessee in default under section 201. And there is a simultaneous amendment in section 40A1A that in such situation, the date on which the payee has filed the return of income will be considered as the deemed date of deduction by the deductor, and therefore no disallowance should be made in the case of the payer. Now this amendment, which was inserted, I guess in the year 2014, Bombay High Court has held that this is a curative amendment and therefore this amendment will apply retrospectively from the year 2005. So in all the cases where any appeals are pending for the disallowances under section 40A1A, the second proviso inserted in section 40A1A, if the payee has already complied with his tax obligation, then a reliance can be made on this particular decision that this proviso is retrospective from the year 2005. Next decision of Mumbai Tribunal, Lakshmi Estate Private Limited. This also is going to be a very interesting decision, and in fact, probably, that is my gut feeling, that this is going to be a very huge area of litigation in the days to come. The section 43CA, which has been inserted, to tax the notional stamp duty value in case of builder developers, similar to section 50C. The moment this 43CA was inserted, the first basic question was that in which year this section 43CA will be applied, because generally we see in case of builder developers, either we are following a percentage completion method or we are following a project completion method. So the question was, looking at the language of section 43CA, it says there is a transfer of land or building. So if I am following a project completion method, I will offer the income when the project is fully completed, though in the intervening period, agreements might have been executed. So question arises, will 43CA apply in the last year when the project is completed, or it will apply in the year in which the registration takes place? And in the reverse scenario, where I follow a percentage completion method, so I offer the income based on the stage of completion rate, how 43CA will be applied, whether it will be applied year on year, will it be spread, or it will be applied at the end of the year. So in fact, there are various facets of this controversy. I'm not going to touch all of them. Interesting proposition, this particular developer of Lakshmi Estate Private Limited, here the assessee was following project completion method. The agreements which were executed in this particular year, but this was not the year in which project was completed. Project was completed in the later year and entire income was offered in that next year. When the scrutiny assessment took place for the prior year, department made the addition for the difference between the stamp duty value and the actual consideration. Assessee made two arguments. Firstly, it says that 43CA should be strictly interpreted. What it says is there should be transfer of land or building or both. In this particular year, I have only entered into registration of that particular properties because the construction is still going on. There is no land or building in existence, and therefore there is no transfer of land or building. Transfer will be completed when I hand over the possession. And the second alternative contention is that if at all addition is to be made, addition to be made in the year in which project is completed, because I am following project completion. Tribunal held in favor of the assessee, saying that in this particular year, because the flats or offices or whatever was the property was still under construction, there is no transfer of land or building, and therefore section 43CA cannot apply. Surprisingly and interestingly, they did not express any opinion whether this particular addition can be made in the year in which the project is fully completed. They only restricted it to the dispute before them, whether an addition can be made in this year, and they said the addition cannot be made in this year because there is no transfer of land or building in this particular year. Coming to the next topic, capital gain. A very common dispute. Alpesh, is there a problem with the connection? Am I audible?
Now you're audible.
Okay. A very common dispute that when we book a property with a builder, we get an allotment letter. In the earlier, of course, after RERA, now we get an agreement entered into the moment we pay 10% consideration. But in earlier scenario, when initially we used to get allotment letter, then we pay various installment later on, agreement is executed, and we sell the property. A very common question that often arises is from which date the period of holding is to be counted. Whether it should be counted from the date of allotment or whether it should be counted from the date on which the registration takes place, or whether it should be counted from the date on which I actually get the possession of the property. In this particular decision of Bombay High Court, reported in 413 ITR, Bombay High Court applied CBDT circular, very old circular of 1986, reiterated again in 1993, there it is the date of allotment, which will be considered as the date of acquisition. The registration, subsequent payment of installment, delivery of possession. They say it's a consequential action of that allotment. Allottee gets the title or the property on the issue of allotment letter, and such allotment is final unless it is cancelled or the allottee withdraws from the allotment or he defaults. If no default is done by the allottee, he is making payment as per the allotment letter, and the property is properly identified in the allotment letter as to what is the kind of property, how much is the area, etc. Then he gets a title on the date of allotment itself, and from that date, the period of holding to decide long term or short term should be considered.
Hello. Yeah.
Next one, interplay of section 50C and 54EC. This is a decision which may disturb the assessees against the assessee and jurisdictional high court decision. See, when a notional addition is made under section 50C, if I give an example, it will be very better to understand. Suppose the actual consideration of a property is 40 lakhs rupees, and I invest the entire 40 lakh rupees in the bonds eligible under section 54EC. However, the stamp duty value of that property is say 50 lakhs rupees. So what the officer will do is, for calculation of capital gain, he will consider the consideration to be 50 lakhs rupees. The question arises is, what will happen to 54EC? Now the practical scenario, practical problem with the assessee will that my total actual consideration is 40 lakhs rupees, and therefore the maximum what I can invest is only 40 lakhs rupees. So what I have received is 40 lakhs rupees, I have invested 40 lakhs rupees, and therefore whole of my capital gain, including the notional extra capital gain of 10 lakh rupees, which arose because of the application of 50C, should be exempted under section 54EC. Because what 54EC requires is the investment of the net consideration and not the deemed consideration under section 50C. However, this argument was rejected by the Bombay High Court on the logic that this will defeat the very purpose of section 50C, that where there is an understatement of consideration, people will invest the entire actual consideration in 54EC, and indirectly they will go out of 50C. Therefore, Bombay High Court held that the 54EC exemption will be calculated only with reference to your actual investment. So even if you have invested entire actual consideration of 40 lakhs rupees, if the notional consideration is 50 lakhs as per the stamp duty value, on the balance 10 lakh rupees, you will have to pay capital gain tax. Next, there are 2-3 series of decisions about section 45(4). This is also a very common fight between assessee and the department. And generally, I would say with all humble submission, a poor understanding of 45(4). What 45(4) says is that if there is a transfer of a capital asset by a firm to a partner, so the crux of 45(4) is transfer of capital asset by a firm to partner. That transfer could be either on account of dissolution or otherwise. And Bombay High Court in A.N. Max case held that this otherwise would even include a situation of retirement. Accepted that dissolution or otherwise could mean a situation of retirement. However, for 45(4) to apply, what is required is there is a transfer of capital asset by firm to the partner. So for example, I am a partner in a partnership firm, and if I am retiring, there is no dissolution, but I am just retiring. So whatever is my share in that partnership firm, including say the revalued gains, the appreciation in the market value of the property belonging to the firm, etc., etc., goodwill of the firm, etc., etc. So my total interest, suppose it is evaluated to be rupees 2 crore rupees. Now how the firm is going to discharge this 2 crore rupees to me? Say for example, my capital in the firm was 1 crore and 50 lakhs rupees. But because I am retiring, I will say that there is appreciation in the market value of this premises, these assets, etc., etc. I should get a share out of that increase in revaluation. I should get a share out of goodwill, etc. And that is computed at 2 crore rupees. So I get say extra 50 lakhs rupees. Now how they will pay this 2 crore rupees to me? There are two situations possible. Either a firm pays me 2 crore rupees by way of check, that is money consideration. And secondly, firm gives any property to me worth rupees 2 crores. If the firm gives any property, any capital asset to me to discharge this liability of 2 crore rupees, naturally 45(4) is invited in the hands of the firm because there is a transfer of capital asset by the firm to the partner. However, in a situation where the firm discharges this 2 crore rupees by money consideration, so because I am retiring, so they might admit some new partner, he infuses capital, and from that I get the 2 crore rupees by way of check payment. Department tries to apply section 45(4) in this situation in the hands of the firm, sometimes in the hands of the partner, by relying on Bombay High Court A.N. Naik saying that in A.N. Naik's case, Bombay High Court has held that the word otherwise include a situation of retirement. No dispute on that. We can't dispute because it is jurisdictional High Court decision, and therefore accepted that otherwise would include retirement. However, two things required for 45(4). Firstly, 45(4) cannot apply in the hands of partner. Secondly, 45(4) cannot apply without there being a transfer of capital asset. So in a situation where this extra 50 lakhs rupees, that entire 2 crore rupees is paid to me by way of money consideration, neither 45(4) can apply in the hands of firm, nor 45(4) can apply in the hands of the partner. That was the decision of Bombay High Court in Electroplast. In fact, in this decision, they relied on Karnataka High Court full bench decision of Dynamic Enterprises. Again, in DS Corporation, this is a Mumbai Tribunal decision on the same proposition. It's a third member decision. And another decision of Bombay High Court in Hemlata Shetty, also on the same proposition. In fact, in one of these decisions, there was also an argument by the department that this extra 50 lakhs rupees in my example, which the partner is receiving, that will be brought to tax under 45(1). That also is not accepted by the tribunal and court by saying that there is no transfer in this situation. My interest in the partnership firm cannot be considered as a capital asset. And as far as the firm's capital asset are concerned, one more hypothesis or one more proposition given by the department in such cases that suppose there were earlier 5 partners in the firm. So all the assets of the firm belong to 5 people. I as a partner also had a share in those assets of the firm. So when I retire, to the extent of my share in those assets, there is a relinquishment in favor of the other 4 partners. And therefore, I should be brought to tax under the head capital gain. This proposition is also negated repeatedly by the courts by saying that firm is a separate assessable entity under the Income Tax Act. Assets belong to the firm. Even after my retirement, assets belong to the firm. So this hypothetical situation of earlier 5 owners of those assets and now 4 owners of those assets, and therefore hypothetically my share getting transferred to other partners, not accepted by tribunals and high courts. Next decision, Sadiq Sheikh. This is High Court of Bombay at Goa, where they held that for section 247 clause 5. Here the transfer was not of stock in trade, the transfer was of capital asset, but the property was under construction. And therefore, merely by entering into an agreement for a transfer, there could not be a capital gain liability. Assessee relied on section 53A Transfer of Property Act, saying that for 53A Transfer of Property Act, there needs to be a handing over of possession. Because in the current year, there is only an agreement entered into, property is still under construction, there is no question of handing over of the possession, and therefore there is no transfer. This was held by the Panji Tribunal, later on accepted by Bombay High Court. Department filed SLP in the Supreme Court, which has been rejected. Next decision again of Bombay High Court. Tenancy rights transfer. That popularly Pagdi system which we call. So when those tenancy rights were surrendered, assessee received a compensation of 50 lakh rupees, which was invested under section 54 EC. And therefore, because the cost of acquisition of tenancy right as per section 55 is nil, whatever consideration 50 lakh rupees is received is the capital gain, entirely invested in bonds and therefore fully exempt. Department came out with a new argument that this whole transfer of tenancy right etc. is a colorable device. There was no tenancy right existed, and therefore this compensation received is transferable, is taxable under the income from other sources, and therefore there is no question of exemption under section 54 EC. This was not accepted by the tribunal. This was not accepted by Bombay High Court, saying that once there is a tenancy right, without pointing out defect in the title to those tenancy right, without leading evidence, department cannot merely on the basis of suspicion hold the transaction to be suspicious and therefore cannot consider it to be a sham transaction and not of a capital asset. And by this logic of suspicion, department cannot change the head of income. Head of income remains capital gain and therefore rightly allowed exemption under section 54. Next decision again Bombay High Court in respect of family settlement. You all are aware there are various decisions that in case there is a bona fide family settlement, it is not considered as a transfer. So in case of a family settlement where there are various properties standing in the names of different members of the family, so if there is a dispute and to settle that dispute, there is interchange, one property standing in one name transferred to the other property transferred to other, some cash consideration passing on between the members to equalize their share, etc., etc. That is not considered as a transfer under the general understanding of the word transfer, and therefore capital gain tax liability will not come. In the facts of this case, what had happened was there was a property belonging to one particular person who had got 3 sons, and he had partitioned that property between 3 different sons. So one this particular property under the deed of partition received by one particular son, and after so many years there was some claims made by legal heirs of the other sons from the legal heirs of this particular son, and there was some passing of consideration. In the facts of this case, Bombay High Court has held that where there was a partition deed, whereby different properties were already partitioned to different heirs, and this particular property received by one particular son. So as per the partition deed, the other sons had absolutely no pre-existing right in the property, and therefore they did not consider it to be a family settlement. They say family settlement, Bombay High Court says family settlement is a situation where there is a pre-existing right of all the family members in one property. So if there is a pre-existing right and dispute arises, it will be considered as a case of a family settlement. But there is not a pre-existing right, it is not a case of a family settlement, and therefore if there is a relinquishment of any right, capital gain liability will arise. Next decision of Bangalore Tribunal. In this case, assessee was entitled to actually deduction under section 54F, but he wrongly claimed in the return of income deduction under section 54. And only on this count, the deduction was denied to the assessee, that in the return of income you have claimed under 54. Tribunal did not accept this proposition. They say if he is rightly entitled to deduction under 54F, if all the conditions of 54F are fulfilled, merely a wrong filling of a particular column in the return of income cannot disentitle the assessee for that legitimate deduction. This serial number 22, Delhi Tribunal, decision of Mukta Gupta. Next, Mumbai Tribunal, decision of Vijay Ratan Mittal, a very long order. Another Kolkata Tribunal, decision of Mahavir Jhamar. And lastly, Mumbai Tribunal decision in case of Narayan Ramchandra Rathi. All these 4 decisions, in fact, there are many such, I have included these 4 relating to penny stock. We all are aware what is the prevailing controversy about these penny stock assessments and what is the havoc created by this term penny stock by the department. There are many genuine transactions just because that particular script is identified to be a penny stock, just because there is an abnormal high in the price of the stock, all the transactions in those scripts are considered to be malafide, and in spite of leading all the evidences, documentary evidences, without pointing out any defect in those documentary evidences, additions are made. So if you go through all these 4 decisions, generally all these decisions speak different assessments. I filed many appeals for these penny stock cases, and if you find that all the different officers, you'll find it different kinds of orders. In some cases, of course, there is a last year, because there was an SOP issue, that long orders on penny stock where they tried to give the statistical details of the price movement, etc., and very lengthy orders are passed. But if you see, in majority of the order, there is denial. Majority of those assessment order, there is denial of natural justice. The statements recorded, if any, not given to the assessee. Investigation being report not given to the assessee, and no defect pointed out in the documentary evidence submitted. So in all these decisions, if you go through these decisions, tribunal has repeatedly held that when no defect is pointed out, there is evidence about purchase, evidence about sale, contract notes are there, movement is shown in the demat account, without providing opportunity of cross-examination, etc., addition cannot be made. Just because there is an abnormal price movement in the price of the particular script. Skip few of these decisions. The presentation will be shared by the study circle for the paucity of time, because I think I have around 90 slides, already 6:15. So I'll try to focus on more important ones. This one, Mumbai Tribunal in case of 50C. Now, in the facts of this case, there was a property where there was so much dispute. There was so much encumbrances on the property. Possession was with third person. In the records, there were certain other claimants of the property. Trust tried to sell that property on as is where is basis by making advertisement in the newspaper and following all the guidelines of the Bombay Trust Act. So naturally the consideration which actually they received was less than the stamp duty value. A very beautiful decision of Mumbai Tribunal. They held that when the title itself is defective, you cannot consider it to be sale of land or building. What you are actually selling is a right in that particular property, and therefore in that situation 50C cannot apply, because 50C applies in a situation when there is a transfer of land or building. So if there is title is defective, there are encumbrances on the property, what this trust is transferring is only certain rights in that property, and rights in the property is different from the property. Next, Mumbai Tribunal. In fact, this is also a very common decision. Previously also there have been such decision that when you are counting the number of houses for the purpose of section 54F, because 54F says that on the date of transfer I should not be owner of more than one house. So for counting this number of houses, what should be the fate of joint ownership? And repeatedly tribunal has been holding that a joint ownership will not be considered as an ownership, and therefore, if I am owning one house property in my say own name, there is another house property which is in joint name with one of my family member. For the purpose of 54F, I should not be considered as owner of two houses. I should be considered as owner of only one house, and therefore I should not be disentitled to exemption under 54F. Income from other sources. Serial number 32, Bombay High Court in Kayan Jamshid Pandole. Here also some interesting thing happened. This company came out with a buyback of shares. Department tried to tax the particular shareholder on that buyback, and exemption was claimed by the assessee. Just give me a moment. Sorry. So here basically the question was whether this is a buyback or this is a dividend under section 222D. There is a case of a capital reduction, and in the scheme of capital reduction, shares were bought back by the company. Now 222D says that in case of a reduction of capital, to the extent of accumulated profits in the company, it will be considered as a dividend. So the alternate proposition given by department itself was that if it is a dividend, because the company had not paid tax under section 115O, shareholders should not get an exemption under section 1034. If we read the language of section 1034, section 1034 only says that dividend referred to in section 115O. And section 115O, in the explanation, there is definition of dividend, which says that dividend shall have the same meaning as given in section 222, except clause E. So 222E was not covered by 115O. Except 222E, all other clause A, B, C, D will fall under 115O. And therefore, Bombay High Court held that merely because the company had not paid dividend distribution tax, department cannot deny exemption to the shareholder under section 1034. Department is free to recover the dividend distribution tax from the company by using all its machinery against the company. Chandigarh Tribunal, Pankil Garg. Now here if you see section 56(2)(7), the definition of relative. Now of course we have section 56(2) clause 10. If you read the definition of relative, it says the relative is defined in relation to an individual, various family members are given. Then the next limb says in relation to an HUF, any member of the family. So if an HUF receives anything from a member of the family, that gets exempted under section 56(2)(10), earlier 7, now 10, because HUF is receiving from a member of the family who is a relative. However, the reverse scenario is always troubling. When I as a member of HUF receive from the HUF. So Chandigarh Tribunal here laid down two propositions. First of all, it said that if I as a member of HUF receive something from HUF out of the income of the HUF, I get an exemption under section 10 clause 2 because this is out of the income of the HUF. Secondly, a very beautiful observation on 56(2)(7). They say that if a property belongs to HUF, all the members of HUF have some pre-existing right in the HUF. And therefore, when I receive something from the HUF, I already have a right in that family property. When I already have a right from the family property, you cannot say that I have received something without consideration, and therefore at the threshold, 56(2) is not applicable to. Therefore, even though in relation to individual, HUF is not included in the list in the definition of a relative, they say because I have a pre-existing right in the HUF property, this cannot be considered as received without consideration, and therefore 56(2) doesn't apply. They also explained the reverse analogy that when HUF receives something from an individual, the entire family does not have a pre-existing right on the individual's asset, and therefore to make it exempt, specifically in the definition of a relative, vis-a-vis an HUF, it is specified that any member of the family is a relative of the HUF. But when an individual receives from HUF, it is never without consideration, and therefore 56(2) doesn't apply. Of course, we have earlier Rajkot Tribunal decision which says that HUF is a group of relatives. Therefore, all the members of HUF who are falling in the definition of relative vis-a-vis an individual. So even by that route, if I receive from HUF, I get an exemption. And here one more argument, you can say an additional argument in this Chandigarh Tribunal decision, that because I have a pre-existing right in the family property, it cannot be considered as received without consideration. Next decision. Series of decision, in fact, Delhi Tribunal, India Today Online Private Limited, then again Delhi Tribunal is Cinestan Entertainment Private Limited, and then a Clearview Healthcare Private Limited. Now, all these decisions relate to, even the last one, India Convention and Culture Center Private Limited, relate to section 56(2)(7)(b) and the valuation. What is this 56(2)(7)(b)? It says that when security premium is received, we need to find out the fair market value, and if the premium received, if the consideration for the issue of share is more than the fair market value, that excess will be charged to tax in the hands of the company. The fair market value for the purpose of this 56(2)(7)(b) for evaluating whether the security premium is correctly charged or not. This fair market value is defined in the explanation. There are two limbs in the definition. The first limb takes us to Rule 11 UA, and in Rule 11 UA, there are two methods given. One is NAV based, and second is discounted cash flow based. But in the main section itself, the definition of fair market value, there are two clauses. First clause takes us to Rule 11 UA. The second clause says that any other value which the assessee justifies to the satisfaction of the assessing officer based on the value of its assets, whichever is higher. So slightly confusing definition of fair market value in the context of 56(2)(7)(b), but in very simple words, I will say it is higher of three things. Number one, NAV based value as per Rule 11 UA. Number two, discounted cash flow method based value as per Rule 11 UA. Number three, any other value based on the assets of the company. So because an option is given to me, naturally I will take, as an assessee, I will take a position that higher of these three things. Now in these all four decisions which I just narrated, one or two different aspects, so I will just summarize what are the proposition given. First proposition given is that when the option is given by the assessee, if I follow say DCF method, assessing officer cannot disregard that. No, you don't go by DCF method, you go by asset based method, or you go by the NAV based method. Option is with the assessee, you cannot tinker with them. Secondly, as far as valuation report is concerned, without pointing out a defect in the valuation report, assessing officer cannot disregard that value. That will be binding on him. If he finds out a defect in the valuation report, then he can find out his own valuation. But even in that scenario, he has to go by the methodology given in the act and the rules. He cannot come out with a fourth method to say that this is the value of the asset. So say for example, I follow a DCF method. He may point out certain defects. What are those, the nature of defects? How much tenable, not tenable? That's a separate area of dispute. But assuming there are certain defects in my DCF method, then he can disregard this. But there also, he has to follow DCF method, removing those defects. He cannot point out his own method. Then the third proposition in this decision is that when I justify the value of share on the basis of intrinsic value of my assets, disregarding NAV based, disregarding DCF based. So even that is permitted because the second limb of the definition of fair market value says that any value which the assessee satisfies the assessing officer based on the value of its assets. So if I have certain intellectual property, if I have certain immovable property whose current valuations have skyrocketed, so based on such proposition also, I can justify the share premium. Then the last proposition in this series of decision is that this clause 7b has been inserted to curb the malpractice or money laundering of introducing my own money into my company in the garb of securities premium. Therefore, they say when the transaction is not tainted, when an outsider whose credentials are not doubted, genuinely somebody is investing in my company. So naturally as a company, I will try to charge as high a share premium as possible. And if it's a genuine transaction is not doubted, then in that scenario, merely because the premium is high, section cannot be invoked because there is no money laundering or bogus capital building involved in such a transaction. These were 3-4 decisions related to section 56 to 7b, even this Mumbai tribunal in case of Narang excess. Next, moving to the next topic, income chargeable under section 68, 69, 69a, 69b, etc. The very first decision, NRA Iron and Steel, bogus share capital and premium. In the facts of this case, assessing officer had issued summons. Those were not replied. They did not appear before the assessing officer. They did reply, but reply was filed in the Tapal, but they did not personally appear before the officer, though required by the assessing officer. The returns of income of the investor companies were showing a very minimal income, so creditworthiness was not established, and therefore the addition was made. Commissioner appeal had deleted, saying that assessee had submitted all the evidences regarding the identity, creditworthiness and genuineness, and therefore the burden is discharged. CIDP deleted the addition. Tribunal also accepted that proposition. Court also accepted that. All along the assessee was successful. Supreme Court in an ex parte decision reversed all the decisions of tribunal, Commissioner Appeal, Tribunal and the High Court. And Supreme Court said that where the officer is doubting the genuineness of the transaction, then in that situation, a higher primary onus will lie on the assessee, and assessee cannot simply put only the documentary evidences on record that this is the return of income filed by the taxpayer, this is the PAN number, so now you can make a further inquiry. Now, if the assessing officer has made a further inquiry and those people did not appear before the assessing officer, then they say a higher onus is established, is shifted on the assessee to establish even the source of money in the hands of those investor companies. And therefore 68 addition was upheld by the Supreme Court in this. Subsequently, there are quite a few decisions which have explained this decision of NRA Steel, like this Bombay High Court in Ami Industries. Also the tribunal decisions like this Kolkata Tribunal and Baba Bhuthnath Trade and Commerce Limited, which also say on the similar line that of course primary onus is on the assessee, but once this primary onus is discharged,
Athva, to my mind,
it shifts on the
cases like
assessing
this.
officer. If the assessing officer is not satisfied and is doubting the very genuineness of the transaction, then the onus again shifts on the assessee, and assessee will have to ensure that those investors appear before the assessing officer, or in the alternate, assessee in that situation where the genuineness of the transaction is doubted, assessee will have to explain even the source of source in the hands of the investor when the genuineness of the transaction is in question. Next is a very useful decision, Odeon Builders Private Limited in 418 ITR, where Supreme Court held that merely on the basis of a report of investigation wing, addition cannot be made. There has to be a further scrutiny. Report of the investigation wing can be a starting point, but not only the conclusive evidence. Thereafter, there has to be further scrutiny, and in that further scrutiny, assessee should be given fair opportunity of natural justice to rebut all the findings of the investigation wing. In fact, this is a case, the facts of the case was related to bogus purchases. But here the assessee was on a very strong footing that assessee not only furnished the confirmations, sales tax assessment details of those alleged Hawala dealers, but also the income tax returns filed by those Hawala dealers. So, stock records, purchase evidences, sales, subsequent sales evidence, correlation, purchase sale. Apart from that, the most important evidence was the income tax returns, balance sheet of those persons. These were also submitted. Still, addition was made by the assessing officer, merely relying on the investigation wing report that those persons were Hawala dealers, and therefore, in the facts of the case, addition was deleted. Department went to the Supreme Court. Supreme Court also upheld those decision of deletion of the addition, that further scrutiny is a must, natural justice is a must, without pointing out defects in the documents, without providing cross-examination, etc. Addition cannot be made. Next one, Jammu and Kashmir High Court, Kohinoor Enterprises, and even Bombay High Court, Goa Bench in Ivan Singh, that Section 68 addition can be made only in the year in which the transaction has originated. So if I have taken a loan in year 1 and in year 2 there is an opening balance of this loan, and suppose the scrutiny takes place of year 2 and the officer is not satisfied with the genuineness of that loan, even in that scenario he cannot make the addition in year 2, because in year 2 there is no fresh credit found in the books. It is merely an opening balance. It's a different question. Assessing officer may reopen the assessment of prior year if the other conditions of section 147 are fulfilled. But in year 2 or subsequent year, when it's just a case of opening balance, even if the loan is not found to be genuine, addition cannot be made in subsequent years. Next, Bombay High Court in case of PAT commodity relating to client code modification. Here the assessee himself was the broker, and the allegation was that assessee, by using the CCM, helped the other persons to claim bogus losses. What the department did was, whatever was the amount of transactions of those alleged CCM, that entire addition of those entire amount involved in those transactions was added in the hands of the company. Assessee's plea was that CCM is an accepted feature. To some extent it is permitted, and without finding out the defect in the evidences and without finding out evidence, that even assuming that assessee has helped the others to claim bogus losses, that entire transaction cannot be added in the hands of the assessee. What maximum could be added in the hands of the assessee? was the commission income. But what the department did was, it had added the entire consideration, and that deletion of that addition was upheld by the Bombay. Mumbai Tribunal, here is the case of an assessee who was alleged to be a beneficiary of taking a bogus loss by taking client code modification. Here also, Mumbai Tribunal held that unless there is an adverse report by SEBI investigation against the assessee, where the stock exchange norms permit up to 1% client code modification without making a further investigation about the whole transaction, about the time gap between the actual time of the transaction and the alleged modification timing, etc., etc., transaction cannot be doubted. Then Bombay High Court, Mohammad Haji, another Bombay High Court, Param Shakti Distributors Private Limited. In fact, series of decisions. We all are aware in case of bogus purchases cases, generally tribunal is deleting the addition on the basis of some percentage, 12.5%, in some cases 5% addition is upheld, rest of the addition is deleted. In all those cases, generally department is moving the High Court. And because here it is based on information from external agency, that is sales tax department, department pleads that tax effect circular, the monetary limit, was generally to move High Court against the tribunal decision. The tax effect, the current limit is 1 crore. Less than 1 crore tax effect, department cannot go to the High Court. But in that circular, there is an exception that where assessment is based on evidence from external agencies. So department tries to take shelter of that particular, and even in small cases, they are filing appeal to the High Court. And generally in such cases, High Court is not admitting those appeal, saying that the percentage addition, sometimes the addition is based on GP percentage. In Mohammad Haji's case, the addition was made, tribunal had upheld the addition based on differential GP. That what was the GP on those alleged bogus transaction and what was your GP on your accepted transaction. If there is a difference in that GP, to that extent, there is a suppression, that addition can be made. And High Court is repeatedly dismissing the appeals of the department. Coming to the next topic, deductions. Kerala High Court, very big 104 pages decision, full bench decision on section 80P2 read with section 80P4. This was a case where assessee was claiming to be a primary agricultural credit society. We all are aware that after the 2007 amendment, where cooperative banks are not entitled to deduction under section 80P, and the exception given under 80P4 is primary agricultural credit society. Now the dispute before the Kerala High Court was whether assessing officer can do a factual finding on the activities of the society to find out whether it is a primary agricultural credit society, or should it solely rely upon the certificate issued under the relevant state legislation as to the nature of that society. If you see, there was one decision of Kerala High Court in 384 ITR, Chirakkal case, where Kerala High Court held that assessing officer is not empowered to do this factual finding, and if the relevant state legislation says that this is a primary agricultural credit society, assessing officer should grant 80P deduction to that society. But there was another decision of Kerala High Court in 363 ITR, where Kerala High Court, relying on certain observations of Supreme Court in Citizen Cooperative Society, held that we should not go, the officer should not go only by the certificate issued by the state legislature, and he should see the activities of the society to find out whether it will be entitled to deduction under 80P2 or it will be barred by virtue of 80P4. Now, why I am saying about this particular decision is that though we might not have many clients about primary agricultural credit society in Maharashtra, in cities of Mumbai, say, but we have many SSEs which are credit societies. And those cooperative credit societies which are claiming deduction under ATP 2A1, there also dispute is raised by the department saying that these cooperative credit societies are analogous to cooperative banks. In fact, they are cooperative banks. That is the hypothesis, that is the argument of the department, and therefore they deny the deduction to credit societies by relying on ATP 4. Therefore, in my opinion, even in all those disputes, this Kerala High Court full bench judgment now will be invoked by the department that will not go merely on the registration granted by the state societies or the state legislation that you are a cooperative credit society, but will go on, the assessing officer is empowered to do a factual finding on the activities of the assessee to see whether it is only a cooperative credit society or whether it is a cooperative bank, so that whether it is entitled to reduction under ATP 2 or barred by virtue of ATP 4. One more topic I will take, transfer pricing. It's already 6:45, then we'll stop for the question answer. Two very important judgments relating to transfer pricing, 2 or 3, that only I'll touch up. When this transfer pricing was originally introduced in the year 2001, there was an old CBDT instruction of 2003 that where the transaction, the value of international transaction is more than 5 crore, then the AO has to mandatorily refer to the transfer pricing officer. Later on, that limit was increased to 15 crores. And the facts of this case, even though the transaction value was more than this particular threshold of 5 crore or 15 crore, whatever applicable, AO did not make a reference to the transfer pricing officer. He himself made certain addition based on arm's length price, and an addition was made based on that, which was challenged by the assessee. And one of the challenge by the assessee was that since AO should have made a reference to the TPO and he has not made a reference, entire addition should be deleted. High Court in this case held that it was for the officer to decide whether he should make a reference or not make a reference. But because the CBDT instruction is binding on the officer and AO has not made the reference to the TPO, therefore the addition was deleted. Department challenged it before the Supreme Court. In fact, they succeeded in Supreme Court, but Supreme Court said that because a reference was not made by the TPO, addition cannot be applied because he was not empowered to determine the ALB. However, they set aside the assessment to the assessing officer with a direction that he can now make a reference to the TPO in terms of the CBDT instruction. So, fighting till Supreme Court, assesses back to square one to the assessment stage, where now the reference will be made to the TPO. Another decision of Bombay High Court, that I am purchasing the shares. So there are two situations. When I am issuing shares, now 56 to 7B questions me on the fair market value of shares. And when I am purchasing shares, 56 to 7, now 56 to 7A and now 56 to 10. If I am purchasing shares and the consideration is less than the fair market value, then the difference is brought to tax under 56 to 7. Now, where I am buying shares of a foreign company and there is an undervaluation, whether there is a question of an international transaction, Bombay High Court held that in this situation there is no income arising. In the facts of the case, this was prior to the amendment under section 56(2), where both the limbs, buying at undervalue and charging high premium, were not in the statute. Therefore, before the amendment, they say that issue of share, purchase of shares cannot lead to any income, and unless there is an income arising from an international transaction, the provisions of chapter 10 leading to transfer pricing are not applicable. Last and very important decision of Karnataka High Court, which has upheld the Bangalore Tribunal decision. We are all aware that based on the Supreme Court's recommendation in GlaxoSmithKline case, an amendment was made in section 92 in chapter 10 and also simultaneously in section 48 too, where even domestic transactions were covered by transfer pricing regime if they exceeded a threshold limit of certain amount. Last year, in fact 3 years back, Finance Act 2017, government amended section 92BA and clause 1 was omitted, which had a reference to section 48(2). With the omission of this clause 1 in section 92BA and the reasoning given by the Parliament while making this omission was that this introduction of transfer pricing provision in domestic transaction is leading to unnecessary litigation, and therefore they omitted it. Domestic transfer pricing is still applicable for tax holiday sections of ATIE, etc. But vis-a-vis 48(2), Finance Act 2017 is omitted. After this omission, Bangalore Tribunal in tax court overseas case held that because there was no simultaneous saving clause, this omission needs to be considered as retrospective from year 2012 when 92BA was amended. And this position is now also upheld by Karnataka High Court that this omission is retrospectively effect from 2012 or 2013, I think, when this was introduced for related party transaction under 48. The implication is that in between 2013 and 2017, all those scenarios where a reference was made to the transfer pricing officer and the disallowance under 48(2) was made based on the arm's length price. All these references are bad in law, and therefore, if at all any addition is made and the dispute is pending before any appellate forum, benefit of this decision can be taken that the omission of this clause is with retrospective effect, and therefore the reference to TPO itself was bad in law, and hence no addition can be made. LP 652.
So we can go for further 10-15 minutes.
Okay, I don't
If
mind.
you are comfortable with, and presentation will be sharing after the meeting with your recordings.
That's fine, and I'll have some water so that will give me some more comfort.
100%. Meanwhile, sir, up to now only just one question has been asked. One query has been raised by one of the member. So we'll take it up after, once you are through with.
Okay. So TDS, this 197 lower TDS certificate, practical experiences in many cases, these lower TDS certificates are rejected, or they do some calculation and say, for example, as per that formula, we apply for say a tax deduction certificate. As per our calculation, it is coming under Rule 28AA. It is coming to 1%, but they do some calculation and either they altogether reject our lower TDS application, or they calculate at a higher amount, say 5%, 7%. And generally, in fact, not generally, in all cases, those are unreasoned order. No reasons are communicated. They do some calculation and they grant that certificate. And the most unfortunate part is that that determination under that Rule 1, Section 197 is not appealable. And therefore, the only remedy with the assessee is to file a writ petition before High Court. And the Delhi High Court in this case said that all those rejection, etc., has to be by reasoned order. Without assigning and reason, if that application is rejected, the order is bad in law. Then another, Bombay High Court in Hotel Leela Ventures and also in Make My Trip, Delhi High Court, with reference to Section 194H Commission Brokerage. In the first decision, Hotel Leela, it was about credit card payments, and in this Make My Trip, it was about the payment gateway when we are making some online payment. So the charges which bank are leaving, department says that these assessees were liable to deduct TDS under section 194H, holding this to be commission. Bombay High Court as well as Delhi High Court have held that when we are swiping a credit card, the bank is not acting on behalf of that merchant, and therefore whatever 2%, 1% they are deducting, that cannot be considered as acting on behalf of the merchant, and therefore that cannot be considered as commission or brokerage. So no TDS implication on the credit card charges or payment gateway charges. Tata Communications, this will be a very useful judgment for claiming TDS credit, because many times we, in fact, in this E scenario, the biggest challenge for us is claiming correct TDS credit and reconciling it. Of course, with now the statutory amendment in the ITR forms, where the earlier there was only carry forward introduced, now the brought forward, carry forward, all columns are there. But I believe in spite of all those columns, we are still struggling to get the credit. So Bombay High Court in this case have held that even if a transaction is not properly reflected in the 26 AS, because the 26 AS is not in my control, suppose my tax is deducted, but there is some error in the TDS statement uploaded by the payer, and if he is not getting it corrected, so 26 AS doesn't get reflect the correct details, I cannot be denied the legitimate TDS credit. And Bombay High Court in this case, they held that on the basis of the evidence which I submit, TDS credit should be granted. Again, in the context of TDS credit, Pune Tribunal, a very interesting scenario. Normally in TDS, we come across a situation where the deductor makes a provision for the outstanding professional fees and deducts TDS in year 1. The person who is following cash system of accounting actually receives that amount in the second year, and therefore he shows it in the second year's return of income, and he struggles claiming the TDS credit either in the first year or in the second year. But here there was a new kind of a dispute. Here the assessee, the deductee, shown the income in the very first year on receivable basis. But the payer did not make provision for expense in that year 1. He made the provision in year 2, and therefore he did the TDS in year 2. So it was a reverse scenario. Now assessee said that, see, I am showing the income in year 1. Therefore, even though TDS which has been deducted and paid in year 2 and in 26 years, it is reflecting for future year, I should get a credit in year 1. Department said no, because it is not reflecting in your 26 years, you will not get in year 1. Pune Tribunal says that as per section 199, read with rule 37BA, TDS credit is allowable in the year in which the relevant income is assessable. So if the assessee is offered income in year 1, he should get the credit even if the deductor is showing it in the TDS statement of subsequent year. Next, about assessment and reassessment, 2-3 important decisions. Let us see. Supreme Court Lakshman Das Khandelwal, in this case, officer had not issued notice under section 143(2). Department tried to cover it by relying on section 292(b), which says that assessee has not objected prior to completion of assessment, then later on he cannot complain it at the appellate stage. But that if you read section 292(b), that talks about the dispute relating to service of notice. So Supreme Court held that here the question itself is about not serving of a proper notice, but issue of a notice. If the notice itself is not issued, that defect is not curable under section 292(b) or 292(b). Then Atul Projects India Limited, the time limit for scrutiny notice under section 143(2). Earlier it was 1 year, now it is 6 months. Earlier I think it was 1 year from the end of the month in which return is filed. Now it is 6 months from the end of the year in which return is filed. So here the question was, what had happened was, in year 1, a return was filed and a defect notice was issued in year 2, which was rectified by the assessee in year 2. So the question was, once a return which was earlier considered as a defective return and the defect is cured in year 2, the scrutiny time limit under 143(2), whether it should be considered with reference to year 1 or with reference to year 2. Department tried to argue that it should be considered with reference to year 2 when the defect is cured. Bombay High Court held that no. Once the defect is cured, it relates back to the original return which you have filed under 139, and therefore the time limit for issuing the scrutiny notice is to be counted from the date of filing of the original return of income and not from the date of curing the defect under 139(9). Alpesh, should we stop now? Already 7 o'clock.
Sir, if you we can continue for another 10-15 minutes. Because there are hardly 2 questions up to now.
Okay.
We can wind up by 7:10.
Okay. Saurabh Surikant Mehta, Bombay High Court. This is also in fact a series of such reopening last year took place in bogus purchase cases where originally addition was made by assessing officer on the basis of certain percentage, 12.5%, 5%, 2.5%, all officers having different theories. But once that addition is made on the basis of percentage, judgment of Supreme Court in NK Proteins, which I would say with my all humble submission, grossly misinterpreted and misused by the department, because in NK Proteins case, though factually it was altogether a different proposition, there was a search in the premises of the assessee. In that course of search, blank signed checkbooks of his creditors were found, and in the facts of those cases, Gujarat High Court had reversed the tribunal decision that in this case not a percentage addition but entire purchase should be disallowed, and that position was upheld by the Supreme Court. After the decision, department in all bogus purchase cases, without comparing the facts of different cases, tries to apply this decision of NK Protein and say 100% addition should be made. In many cases where originally percentage addition has been made, department has issued 263 notices saying that the earlier order was erroneous, 100% addition should be made. In many cases, department has issued notices under 147 for now making it 100% addition. So in all such cases where either 147 or 263 action for changing it from a percentage basis to 100% addition, this decision of Bombay High Court would be very useful. This says that once a view has been taken by the assessing officer and a percentage addition is made without any fresh material which was earlier not available, assessing officer now taking a view that 100% addition it is a merely change of opinion, and therefore 147 cannot be done to change it from a percentage to 100%. In my view, this ratio will equally apply even in case of 263 notice, because even for 263, the order should be held as erroneous. If on the basis of that information, assessing officer makes a judgment of percentage addition, that judgment cannot be, that estimation percentage cannot be considered to be erroneous, because ultimately it is a question of an estimation. So even in 263, this will be useful. Next, Rupa Shamsundar Dhumatkar and also Sumit Balkrishna Gupta, Bombay High Court. They say that once an assessee dies, legal heir of the deceased becomes an assessee under section 159. However, what section 159(2) requires is, there are two limbs in 159(2). One about initiation of proceeding against legal representative, and another is about continuation of proceeding. Suppose during the lifetime of an assessee, when the assessee is alive, a notice is already issued to him. For example, a scrutiny notice or a reopening notice is already issued to him. After the issuance of that notice, the proceeding is already started. Now, if the assessee dies during the pendency of the proceeding, what 159(2) requires is that proceeding can be continued against the legal representative by bringing him on record. Second situation, suppose during the lifetime of the assessee, there is no proceeding against him. After he dies, a proceeding, either a scrutiny under 143.3 or a reassessment under 147 is to be done by the department. In that situation, it is not a case of a continuation of proceeding, but initiation of proceeding against the legal representative, and that can be done only by issuing a notice in the name of the legal representative. Practically, in many situations, what happens is, once the assessee has expired, department issues 143.2 or a 147 notice, 148 notice in the name of dead person. Issuing of that notice in the name of a dead person, that action itself is void ab initio, and that is not the correct procedure under section 159. If there is no pending proceeding against the deceased person, the correct position is that legal representative is to be brought on record and the notice is to be issued in the name of the legal representative. If the notice is issued in the name of the deceased assessee, that notice itself is bad. And even if an assessment order is passed in the name of the deceased assessee or in the name of legal heir, but if the original notice is issued in the name of deceased assessee, that assessment is void ab initio. Then Gujarat High Court in this Pankaj by Jasuk Lal Shah has reiterated even the earlier position that the jurisdiction point for a reassessment is issue of notice under section 148(1), which requires a recording of reason under section 148(2). And both these persons acting under 148(1) as well as 148(2) has to be one and the same person. The person who has recorded the reasons under 148(2) has only to issue the notice under 148(1). In the facts of the case, reasons were recorded by Deputy Commissioner under section 148(2), but the reopening notice under 148(1) was issued by the ITU. And therefore, Gujarat High Court held that it is a jurisdictional defect. It cannot be cured even under section 292B, and therefore the consequential assessment, if at all frame, is also bad in law. Lastly, I'll touch this aspect of stay of demand and recovery. See, about the stay of demand, our practical experience as far as income tax is concerned, in indirect taxes, we have a system of pre-deposit. And since last, the earlier amendments in indirect taxes where even the discretion has been taken over and a fixed percentage of pre-deposit is applied. But as far as direct tax is concerned, there was no concept of pre-deposit till now, fortunately not till now. And our earlier experience was generally when we filed an appeal, assessing officer used to insist for 50% payment, 50% payment to give a stay order. In the year 2017, government came out with an instruction that if you pay 15%, 1/5, when your first appeal is pending before commissioner appeal, stay will be granted. Later on, they increase this 15 to 20%. However, this particular instruction of 15% is always misread by the assessing officer, because if you read that particular instruction, that instruction has exception for both the things. That in certain cases, assessing officer, by taking prior permission of the commissioner, can reject even your request for 15 or 20%, and he might insist for 100% or a higher percentage. But for that, he need to take approval of commissioner, and there should be certain reasons for that. And also it provides that in genuine cases, discretion is given that officer can even give you concession from that 15 or 20% and by taking approval from the commissioner. But practically when we move a stay application, officers generally, in many cases, they reject the stay application outright. They say, you first pay 20%, then will entertain your stay application. Then in many cases, even if they entertain your application, they reject it by a non-speaking order. So in this list, I have compiled 2-3 jurisdictional High Court decision. And this one, Mayur Kanjibai Shah. Here there was a reopening. In fact, in Mulund, many people, in fact, in entire Mumbai, many people have issued currently in the last year had received reopening notices where one entity known as Evergreen Enterprises, Mr. Nilesh Varani, there was some search action. Statement was recorded. He gave a statement that he is a broker for cash loans. And therefore, all those persons who have either borrowed through him or lent through him, their cases were reopened and the entire transaction amount was added in their cases. A huge demand is created. In many cases, even in this particular case, Mayur Kanjibai Shah's case, the stay application of 20% was rejected. But in fact, in the facts of this case, the assessing officer was kind enough that when this stay application was moved to the AO and then to the commissioner, that commissioner granted installment for making payment of 20%. Because generally, assessing officer, if you go, he will say either you pay 20% or he will give you installment for 100%. He will not give you installment for 20%. But in this case, the commissioner, the AO rejected application, but the commissioner was good enough to at least accept the request for installment of paying 20%. But the demand was so huge, assessee was not able to pay that 20%. We challenged that stay rejection order where installment were granted to us before Bombay High Court. And in the facts of the case, Bombay High Court held that there are 3 parameters which is reiterated that you need to see the prima facie case. And if you see the assessment order in all these Evergreen Enterprises cases, the assessing officer is generally going on the basis of certain entries recorded in the diary, where there are certain telephone numbers recorded, etc. And on the basis of those entries, without providing an opportunity for cross-examination, without providing a copy of those statements, merely relying on the basis of entries in certain diaries, addition is made. And shockingly, addition is made even in the case where the assessee is alleged to be a borrower from this so-called Evergreen Enterprises. See, in case of lenders, where I'm alleged to be a lender, the question would arise, if I have given a cash loan to some person, from where did I acquire that cash? And therefore, that cash which I have invested could be probably taxed as an unexplained money. However, where there is an allegation that I have taken a cash loan from somebody, even though I have not accounted for that cash loan, there is no income element. But surprisingly, even in the case of borrowers, officers have made 100% additions. Bombay High Court has held that merely on the basis of entries in the diary, making of a huge addition, prima facie does not justify a case, and therefore they say prima facie because this is a good case for the assessee. 100% stay was granted to us by the Bombay High Court in this case of Mayur Kanjibai Shah. Then another case of Delhi High Court and also this Madras High Court, very interesting observations. But in fact, about the stay of demand, the practical experience is always that in spite of so many decisions every year of the High Court, Supreme Court, in fact, in next one decision of Bombay High Court, this Milestone Real Estate Fund, a cost was imposed on the department of rupees 50,000 by the High Court for not passing a speaking order on your stay application. They routinely reject the stay application that yours is not a fit case, or say you pay 20%. But Bombay High Court said that there are 3 parameters: prima facie case, secondly, financial difficulty, and thirdly, balance of convenience. And therefore, a reasoned order should be passed by the assessing officer while rejecting the stay application. But practically it is seen that in spite of these so many decisions, it is seldom that we get a justice at the assessing officer or a commissioner appeal stage. High Court, of course, everybody cannot afford. But where the stakes are large enough, where the 20% itself is going, say 25 lakh, 50 lakhs rupees, the option of going to High Court for the stay would be explored by having a proper consultation. Lastly, if we have waited till now, let us wait for 5 more minutes so that I can, even in miscellaneous, certain important topics can be covered. Alpesh, 5 more minutes?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Go ahead, sir.
So many 179 notices are issued where the company is not able to pay the tax. The directors of those private companies are issued notices under section 179. Orders are passed under section 179. Even in this case, Vanraj Shah. And even in all those 179, majority of those 179 orders, we find that the 179 orders are not followed by the department. Even in this particular case, a routine order was passed by the Bombay High Court, because what 179 requires is that, first of all, there should be a finding recorded by the officer that it is not possible to recover the tax from the company. That is first finding. And second finding, that non-recovery should be attributed to the gross neglect, misfeasance or breach of duty on the part of the director. Then only recovery proceeding can be initiated against the director. Without fulfilling this particular condition, if 179 order is passed, and that order was passed by Bombay High Court in this particular case, but even unfortunately, even 179 order is not appealable, and if at all an action is taken against the director, the only remedy would be either to file a revision petition before Commissioner under 264 or to file a writ petition before the Bombay High Court, before the High Court. And the last one, is Hyderabad Tribunal decision. A claim for exemption can be allowed even if that exemption was not originally claimed in the return of income. So generally, whenever we are making any fresh claim in the assessment, assessing officer relies on the decision of Boyd's India and he says, I cannot accept your fresh claim, otherwise then by way of revised return. But now there are a series of decisions that if there is some pending dispute before Commissioner Appeal, then in that pending appeal, you can raise a fresh claim. Practically, I would say, whenever there is a claim which is missed out in the return of income, the correct course of action would be make that claim whenever assessment is pending before the assessing officer. If he rejects the claim, and if you are, then you can file an appeal to the Commissioner Appeal, and Commissioner Appeal is entitled to admit that claim provided the facts are on record. So if you have missed out for any claims, file it before the assessing officer with all the facts, so that all the facts are already on record. In fact, in Bombay High Court, we have very famous decision of Prithvi Stocks and Share Broker, which said that Commissioner Appeal can entertain a fresh claim even though it is not there in the return of income. With this, I end up with my presentation. I thank my colleagues in the office, Shashank, Radha, Payal, who have worked a lot in this lockdown period to make out this presentation. I thank all the audiences for giving me a patient hearing for more than 2 hours. Thank you very much. If you have some questions and if the time permits and if my throat permits, I'll try to answer maximum of them. Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. It was great to hear you. Before taking other questions, sir, I request my co-committee member, Rishi Agrawal, to take the vote of thanks for sir, and thereafter we'll take up the question answer sessions. Sir, request that your associates Payal will be sharing the screen for the questions. So meanwhile, you can go for that.
Okay.
Yeah, Payal, you can share the screen. Rishi?
Yes. Hello.
Yes, Rishi, audible.
Yeah. Thank you, Advocate Devendra Jain. It is said that those who know do, and those who understand teach. Our today's speaker, Advocate Devendra Jain, or our beloved DJ sir, his detailed understanding and sharing of knowledge on the topic will enable us to do our work in the best possible manner. His detailed compilation of the case studies will keep us updated to the recent judgments. I would like to thank him on behalf of all the members of the study circle to spare time and to share his valuable knowledge with us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Rishi. So the question answers are on your screen. You can take up one by one.
Only one request that I will try to take only if the question is a legal question. If it
Right,
is a
sir.
legal question and too much, then it will be difficult for me to.
Yes, sir. It's at your liberty, sir.
Now with amendment in exemption of dividend, if it exceeds 10 lakh, is taxable whether section 14A would apply. With amendment in exemption of dividend, if it exceeds 10 lakh, is taxable whether section 14A would apply. Yes, if your dividend income is less than 10 lakhs, it is still exempt. Whether valuation need to be done in case of right issue. In case of right issue, whether section 56(2) will apply prices below or above fair market value. If you frankly take my opinion, in case of right issue, section 56(2) will not apply. However, Mumbai Tribunal in Subodh Menon case, Sudhir Menon case, have carved out a new theory of a proportionate right issue and disproportionate right issue. So Mumbai Tribunal says that if it is a case of a proportionate right issue, 56(2) will not apply, but in case of a disproportionate right issue, 56(2) will apply. My personal opinion, with due respect to the tribunal, whether it's a proportionate right issue or a disproportionate right issue, 56(2) does not apply in case of right issue. But to the extent my memory goes, in fact, I think this provision was taken by Kalpesh Katira in our recent RRC at Nasik. Next one, what deductions are allowed from dividend income apart from maximum 20% from interest paid? ये क्या आ रहा है, जरा इसको minimize करो, or can you scroll down the page? I'm not able to read it. Yeah, thank you. For deductions are allowed from dividend income apart from maximum 20% for interest paid, any section added for basic threshold deduction like section 80L, how to do dividend tax planning, also whether a 25% deduction in TDS on salary during lockdown period of COVID-19 is done. Some of the questions do not relate to taxation itself. The first part, 20% deduction is only maximum allowed under section 57, I guess. Now there is an amendment, maximum deduction is 20%. No more deduction, no threshold deduction allowed, ATL etc. not allowed, tax planning etc. cannot be discussed publicly in Zoom platform. 25% deduction in TDS on salary. Sorry, I didn't get this question. 25% deduction in TDS on salary. In assessment order, assessing officer written penalty proceeding will be on concealment of income and furnishing inaccurate particulars. While issuing notice of penalty, only will one lane, that is inaccurate particulars, is mentioned. Whether penalty notice is valid, penalty notice is not valid. Series of decisions of Bombay High Court. Recently, Bombay High Court Goa bench again reiterated. We already have Bombay High Court, Samson Perichary and other decisions. Recently, Goa bench has reiterated that. If the assessee is having only one dividend income, whether dividend up to rupees 5 lakh shall be exempt, and it can claim the assessee having only one dividend income, whether dividend up to 5 lakh shall be exempt, and it can claim the TDS refund deducted by the companies as dividend from one company was more than rupees 5,000. I think most of these questions are not related to my presentation, but related to the current amendment about dividend taxability. So, the next one, the department takes a view that in case of disease assessee, no communication was made to the department by the legal heirs, plus the PN2 was not surrendered, PAN2 was not surrendered, and therefore the notice in the name of the deceased person is not void. Very interesting question. This is a very obvious and a very common stand taken by the department that I was not informed. But if you go through the decision in my presentation, Rupa Dhumatkar as well as Sunit Balakrishna Gupta, in which they had relied on another decision of Madras High Court and Gujarat High Court, and in those decisions, even Delhi High Court in Ravindra Bhatt, etc., it is very clearly coming out that there is no duty cast on the assessee to inform the department. So even if department is not aware, issuing notice in the name of a dead person is void ab initio. And even if you read the observation of Supreme Court in Maruti Suzuki case. Of course, that was a case of amalgamation of company, but Supreme Court has held that notice issued in the name of a non-existent person itself is void ab initio. But however, practically what I would advise is whenever there is a death of an assessee, suppose you are filing the return of income for the year of death, there you'll have to add some person in the e-filing portal as a legal representative of the assessee. And once you add that legal representative, that itself is a sufficient communication. So practically, to err on the safer side, I would advise that once you add on the legal portal as a legal representative, department will not be able to even take this particular stand. Any more question? What is the meaning of legal error for section 153A? There is no specific definition of legal error either for 153A or 158 or 148 or 143. Legal error, you have to go for civil law. Any person who is representing the estate of a deceased person will be considered as a legal heir, because income tax act defined legal representative, not legal heir, and that legal representative is same as defined in the Code of Civil Procedure. So any person who will be, in simplest term, I would say, representing the estate of the deceased is the legal representative. So you'll have to go to the personal laws of that person, whether he's a Hindu, whether he's a Muslim, so whether Hindu Succession Act will apply, whether the Sharia will apply or the Indian Succession Act will apply. Based on that, you need to determine who are the legal representatives. I hope I could do justice with all the questions.
Yes, sir.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, sir. Thanks for giving us your slot and sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, everybody. I think I have mailed you the presentation. You can mail or
Yes, sir. We are sharing the presentation today tonight by itself, and your recording, once it is certified by you, will share that also.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Thank you. Let's end the meeting.